Hello and welcome to MOS Live. You are just in time to join us for our Coolest Science Stories program on special parts of the human brain. My name is Meg. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. Now, if you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to enter your questions, anything you think of at any time, into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. And if you'd like captions in Zoom, you can go to the closed caption button and hit show subtitles. Now, if you're watching this today on YouTube or Facebook, I'm afraid we cannot see your questions at this time, but I'm so glad you're with us. So let's jump right in. Have the human brain. It makes up only 3% of our body weight, but uses 20% of our energy. It controls everything we do and say. It makes us who we are. But how do our brains work? Scientists are on a quest to answer that very question. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about how scientists have discovered that in addition to all of the generalized capabilities that your brain has, different parts of the brain can have very specific jobs. And this knowledge is bringing us closer to a more complete understanding of the inner workings of our brain and our intelligence. Now, these special parts of the human brain are still pretty mysterious. And to illustrate just one example of this, I want you to imagine that you're going to pick up a family member, maybe it's your cousin, from the airport. Now, the two of you are close. You've known each other your whole lives. But when you get there, even though you know that she's waiting for you, you don't recognize her anywhere. You ask a woman standing nearby if you are in the correct passenger pickup area, and she looks at you and she says, "It's me." But try as you might, you still can't recognize her face. This is a condition called prosopagnosia, and it can be something that you grow up with or something that develops later in life after a stroke or a brain injury. It's sometimes called face blindness, but that's actually kind of misleading. People with prosopagnosia have completely normal vision. They can see someone's facial features clearly, they just can't connect what they're seeing to the identity of the person in front of them. And it's specifically faces. They can and do identify individual people by other traits, like their voice or hairstyle or how they walk. It's just faces that don't ring a bell. But why is that? Is there something about the way the brain is wired up that leads to this very specific outcome? Questions like this are what led one scientist to look for special parts of the brain. Her name is Nancy Kanwisher, and she's a neuroscientist at MIT's Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. I want to tell you about Nancy because she's one of the scientists discovering how different parts of our brain can be specialized to process very specific things. So Nancy wanted to know if there's a special part of our brain that's specific to recognizing faces. But this is not an easy task. How do you study a living brain inside a person? And while we do have some tricks up our sleeve for getting to see inside the brain, such as magnetic resonance imaging or MRI. This machine uses magnetic fields and radio waves to non-invasively image the soft tissues inside the body, like the brain. But so far, this only shows us the structure of the brain. To see how different parts might have different functions, scientists like Nancy use a technique called functional MRI, or fMRI, to capture activity in different parts of the brain in response to different stimuli, like looking at a person's face. So it works because extra brain activity requires extra blood flow. It uses energy just like anything else when you exercise. And all that extra blood flow changes the proportion of blood cells carrying oxygen to blood cells that are not carrying oxygen in the part of the brain that's working so hard. That teeny tiny difference can be detected in the MRI machine. So by comparing brain images taken when someone is looking at a picture of a face and when they are looking at a picture of something else, like a chair, we might be able to tell whether a special part of the brain lights up specifically in response to the faces. And that is what happened when Nancy gave it a try. So she was her own first subject. And she got into the MRI scanner, which is totally safe and non-invasive, and she ran an experiment. For 30 seconds at a time, she looked at pictures of faces, alternating with pictures of other objects like an ear of corn or an old telephone or a crab. And every time she looked at a human face, this little area of her brain started firing. And here's what that electric signal looked like over time. Where brain activity is highest, that's when Nancy was looking at a face. And when it was lower, that's when she was looking at the other objects. So this little brain area seemed to be specifically involved in face recognition. But one experiment was not enough to say that for sure. So she tested herself again and again and again on different days to see what happened in her brain. And every time, that same little region lit up when she looked at the faces. But that was still not good enough. What if it was just some quirk of her particular brain? So next, she asked volunteers, and they looked at the faces and looked at the other objects. And over again, this little patch of brain tissue, roughly in the same spot, lit up in response to faces. So that's really something, but what does it actually mean? Is that region of the brain actually responsible for recognizing faces, or is it something else? By itself, all of these results from the MRI scans couldn't answer that question. So Nancy had to keep going. What if this little brain region isn't responding just to faces, but to anything human looking at all? That's one alternative hypothesis that Nancy wanted to test first. So she found more volunteers and this time ran a slightly different experiment. She still showed them pictures of faces while they were in the MRI machine, but this time she alternated them with pictures of hands to see if the same brain region would light up in response to a different human body part. And the results were clear again. That little region, it lit right up in response to faces and not to the hands. But Nancy could think of still other alternative hypotheses too. So she still wasn't done. So faces are curvy, right? Maybe all the curvy shapes, other ones would get a response too. But no. And also, faces are super interesting to us social creatures. So maybe anything we pay close attention to would get a response. Still no. And so on and so forth. Nancy tried anything she could think of that might get that same little brain region to light up, but it only seemed to work for faces. Even after all those experiments, though, Nancy still couldn't say for sure that what she discovered was a region responsible for recognizing faces. All she could say so far was that this region seems to be triggered when you or I or anyone sees a face. To show that it's not just along for the ride, but actually doing something, she had to go even further. And lucky for her and for all of us, there's a way to do that that's safe, ethical, and frankly, just really, really cool. So, first of all, though, you have to know that not everyone's brains are wired exactly the same. There's a ton that we have in common, but there can also be big differences between individuals, and that's okay. Neurodiversity is one of the things that makes our big human family special and, human. Um, but there are some conditions that people can be born with that make it difficult on them, and epilepsy is one of them. Epilepsy is a relatively common neurological condition characterized by irregular electrical activity in the brain, which can cause seizures. Some patients with epilepsy, like these two, have chosen with their doctor's help to try a special kind of test to find out what part of their brain is causing these seizures. And to do that, they each went to the hospital, and a surgeon actually put tiny electrodes directly onto the surface of the brain. This is a pretty extreme test, but it doesn't hurt them. And in fact, they can be awake and talking while the doctors measure the brain's response to stimulation from the electrodes. It's really pretty incredible. So these two patients, since they were in the hospital doing this test anyway, volunteered to help with Nancy's research on faces while they were there. And here's what's really cool about that. The patients, because they're awake and they're talking to you, can describe what they experience when that little face area is stimulated directly. One of them described seeing his doctor's face change right before his eyes. And he said, "You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different." Another patient experienced something very similar to that, and even when looking at another object like a box, the box started to look like a face when that region was being stimulated. So these tests proved more definitively that there really is a special part of the brain that is just for facial recognition. It's not just that it happens to light up when we see other human faces, it's actually directly involved in recognizing faces. And it turns out there's lots of parts of the brain that have very, very specific jobs. The face region here is mapped out in red, um, but there's also a region that corresponds specifically to color, and there's a special area that's sensitive to motion. There's a region specific to other human bodies and body parts, and other regions that correspond to pitched sounds, like music. There's an area that responds to places and other bits that are specific to language. There's even a region in the brain over here, it's marked in light blue, that lights up when you're thinking about another person thinking. And if that sounds strange to you, think about how often that comes up. I'm doing it right now, thinking about whether you might think that's strange. The big picture here is that the human brain has all these little parts that do very, very specific things. And that's what Nancy and her colleagues have learned over the past 20 years or so. That's pretty awesome, really, because it means that these things are just part of our basic machinery as a human being. We all have these special parts in about the same place in our brains, and they make up a fundamental piece of our mind. But it also raises some really big questions. One question Nancy and lots of others are working on now is which specialized parts are we born with and which ones develop as we learn? So let's take an example. Here's a little region shown in purple called visual word form area. And that's a little patch of the brain that responds strongly when you look at words or strings of letters. Now, first, here's what happened when Nancy's team scanned a bunch of 8-year-old volunteers. That big purple bar over there shows you a really strong response right in that region when the participants were looking at words and strings of letters, and a much lower response when they were looking at objects and other things. Now, these subjects happened to be kids who had also come to the lab 3 years earlier, and they had been scanned then when they were 5 years old for a similar experiment. So they compared this with the kids' data from when they were 5 years old, and they asked, what was that region doing when they were 5 before they learned to read? And they found that it was not selectively responsive to words. So that tells you that it's a process of learning to read in between ages 5 and 8 that wires up that region of the brain. Experience is necessary in that case. But then I want to give you another example, and this time we'll go back to face recognition. If experience, that is, seeing other human faces, is necessary for that little part of the brain to become so specialized, what do you think would happen if you grow up never seeing faces? That's something that Nancy's team wanted to learn more about too, and so they asked for volunteers who are congenitally blind, that is, blind from birth. And what they did was they asked these volunteers to explore by touch a series of 3D printed objects, a chair, a face, a rectangular maze, and a hand. And at the same time, they put them in the MRI machine to image their brains. You can see this big wheel of 3D printed objects here. So they had 4 of each kind on the outside of the wheel, and they rotated it while each person was in the MRI machine so they'd be able to touch one at a time. And they found that the blind participants had the same little specialized region in their brains that lit up when touching the 3D printed faces, much more than when touching the other objects. So in this case, that basic wiring must happen early on in development, even without the visual input of actually seeing other faces. There is still so much more to learn, like what other special parts exist and how do these different parts work together? How are they connected? Why don't we have special parts of the brain for other things that we know of, like animals or food? And the answers to these questions could possibly be used to help understand things like autism or to develop better types of artificial intelligence. But it also just brings us closer to a deeper understanding of our brains and our own intelligence. That's what I find so fascinating about Nancy's work and this entire field of neuroscience. And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague Megan to join me, and then the two of us will be happy to answer all of your questions. So Megan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Megan, and I work with Meg at the Museum of Science in Boston, and I am super excited to be here to help answer some questions about this really cool topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. So we do have a couple of questions here. We have one that says, from Ella, would the brain light up the same for animal faces like cats, dogs, or more exotic animals? And was this tested? So I would say, first of all, that I believe the testing that was done to determine the face region in particular by Nancy and her colleagues was pretty specific to human faces, although there may have been, she ran hundreds of experiments actually to try to narrow this down and make sure that that she was really seeing that this region was just responding to faces specifically. So that may have been one of the tests that I don't know about. I do know that um, animal faces are a little bit of a gray area when it comes to training artificial neural networks on face recognition. That when people who do this are training their models, you can get a response similarly from human faces just because there's things that they have in common, like they have two eyes and a nose and a mouth in some cases, depending on the picture. Um, so that is kind of an area that is uh, overlaps some with human facial features. But as far as we know, we don't have a specific area of the brain that is used to recognize or specifically respond to animals.
Yeah, I think some of Nancy's work showed that that region is not just for recognizing animals, like it's really specific to faces. So it's not just like a person or some other type of animal that triggers it. But I think also there have been sort of similar studies, I think at least with dogs, in testing whether or not they have like these similar regions in their brains that specifically recognize faces. And so I believe that it's probably been studied in other animals, but I'm pretty sure I've seen a study where dogs have shown that they have also have a special region of their brain that recognizes faces, which is kind of interesting. You think dogs have facial expressions, so it would make sense for them to kind of recognize faces. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also very similar, I see, to Bailey, age 8, his question, which is about testing stuffed animal faces. That would be another interesting. I know like this is the reason why when you're training computer models to do this kind of thing, a lot of times researchers leave out pictures of animal faces, including stuffed animal faces, so that they're getting when they're trying to figure out or train a model on a particular category of thing, they're not confusing it by giving it something that again overlaps with human facial features. Oh gosh, let's see. We have so many questions. Thank you, everybody. This is great. Um, oh, I don't know how to choose. Okay, so there are a couple of very similar questions. Is there a different, if this is from Logan, is there a different reaction or intensity between a known or familiar face and just another face? And I'm going to group that with a question from Sharon here. Is there a difference in recognizing a face that you like versus one you don't like? Uh, yeah, I think there is a little bit of a difference there where there is an initial processing that determines whether something is any human face. And then there is a further along the pathway in your brain when you're sort of processing all of that visual input information. There's lots of different steps, and it goes from the raw input and it gets passed through a series of steps in your brain. There's the initial recognition that it is a human face at all. And then as you go farther down the pathway, you can get to whether it's somebody that you know, much less somebody that you like or don't like.
Yeah, that's actually something that I don't know anything about whether it's been tested in people, but scientists who study crows have found that crows can recognize people that they like or don't like, so to speak. So people have tested whether, if someone has done something to a crow they don't like, they can actually like recognize and remember that individual and they respond in a different way than they would to an individual who hasn't somehow wronged them. So maybe, I'm not sure about people, but that's actually something that's been studied in crows.
Mhm. Um, oh, I will answer. This is a question from Adam. It's kind of specifically about the study with the congenitally blind volunteers. He asks, what would happen if you tested the object wheel with a person who can slightly see? And I can answer this because they did test the same object wheel on sighted participants as well. They did actually ran the experiment 3 different times. They ran it with the sighted participants where they showed them pictures of each of those objects, and then a second time with the sighted participants touching the 3D printed objects, and then a third time with the blind participants touching the objects. And they compared all of those brain scans together in order to be able to say there was a significant reaction among the blind participants compared, in context with this is what it looks like in a sighted participant. So it worked actually exactly the same. We also, people who can see also have this response to the exploring by touch aspect of those objects. Thanks for that question. Let's see. Well, there's a lot of general brain questions here. Let's see. Um, does our brain tell us when we are hungry? Hmm.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, you're right. Your nervous system is all sorts of connected. And so when you get signals that you're, from your digestive system, that you're hungry, that sends signals to your brain, and, you're you're able to interpret that as, things are happening and I need to eat now. Yeah, your brain ultimately sort of controls everything that we do and say to function and stay alive.
Yeah, and then we have a question here from Mia who asks, what have studies on stroke patients shown us about that face area? Have there been any? And that is a really interesting question. I don't know about studies on stroke patients for this in particular, but that is a really great question because there's so much that we learn from people who have suffered injuries like stroke and then have gone and volunteered for studies like this, because otherwise there's just a way of getting at information that we don't have any other way of understanding because there's no way to run a study on something like that. That would be completely unethical. um, so, so volunteers who have undergone something and something about their abilities has changed before and after can really tell you something about the particular part of their brain that was affected and what that must do as a result. So that's actually a really good question, and it's a really big source of information in this entire field. So thank you, Mia, for that question. All right, I think we have a couple more really cool topics that we can question. But thanks so far for everyone who's asking these questions. I do want to ask Megan about um, how is it that we can actually see what is going on in the brain? What are we actually seeing when we see that little region light up?
Oh, yeah, that is, well, as you described in the presentation, Meg, the way that scientists can see that is using MRI machines, which are special machines that people can go into, and it takes an image of like a part of the body. It doesn't have to be your brain, but in this case, they're taking images of your brain. Um, and so that can show you different parts of the brain and different things about the brain. But specifically, what they used in this study was a little one step further, where they're not just looking at the actual tissue of your brain, they're actually looking at which parts are active. And so when Meg was talking about the brain lighting up, what that's actually showing is which parts of the brain are most active. And the way that they determine that is that the parts of your brain that are working harder, they need more blood and more oxygen. And so that difference is small, I think, relatively, right, Meg? But these machines can detect it. And so the parts of your brain that are really active, like say for this particular study, the part of your brain that's going to be active when you're actually looking at a face, that part of the brain is going to be using more energy and it's going to need more oxygen. And so there's going to be more blood that has more oxygen in it in that region. And so this machine can detect that and it shows that as like that region lighting up. And that's just basically the way the machine is interpreting that and showing it to you in a picture. So that's how they're kind of imaging this so that you can actually see which parts of the brain are working when you're doing different things and which are kind of more just at rest during that time and not working so hard.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. I think sometimes I can get a little carried away describing things as lighting up, and it's always good to sort of unpack what we mean by that, because it's actually this very, very teeny tiny difference that's going on in your brain, and they're looking at different snapshots of the brain taken very quickly and looking at the differences between them in order to tell, and then the actual data that we see where it looks like it's lighting up is sort of the difference in those images. So thanks for unpacking that a little bit for us.
Yeah, it's
Um,
amazing that they can do that.
yeah, it really is, and I think it's a testament to the processing power too that we have that's really advanced in just the last couple of decades. Functional MRI has really been put to use in the last 20 years or so to get at a lot of these really nuanced questions. And one of those questions, just to talk a little further on that result, I'm really fascinated about that little part in your brain that lights up, to say that again, when you're thinking about what someone else is thinking, because it kind of blew me away when I first heard about that, because what is more human than needing to understand what someone else is thinking? Like how important is that for all of our lives as social creatures to sort of have this mental model of what someone else is thinking while you're saying something? Um, and I was just looking into that because it's so fascinating. And the way that they determined that that little brain region was responding specifically to that was they had people in the MRI scanner read stories while they were in there. And they were all sorts of different stories, some of which were about the mental states of people, and some were about non-human objects, like how many planets there are in the solar system and that kind of thing. And by being very specific about which kinds of stories they showed people and how they were doing that, they could get at this like really fundamental, I think, answer, or like just a hugely human fundamental piece of your mind is thinking about what other people are thinking. So that's just really cool.
Yeah, that's such an amazing thing to even think about studying, but then it raises all these other questions like when, similarly to when we're thinking about, like when do you start recognizing faces? When do you start recognizing words? Like at what point in your life do you start thinking about what other people think? I wonder if that's something that's been studied or if people are going to study, do babies or think about what other people are thinking if they don't
Yeah.
really even know what thinking is yet.
I don't know if they know if that part, I don't know about that part of the brain, but for the facial recognition part of the brain and also places, I think there have been studies, again, at the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. There's a group that studies brain development in children and does studies like this using the MRI machine. And they do know that those regions are present as early as between 4 and 6 months in babies. So that does, whatever's happening, if it's being wired up really early, it is happening that early, like without too much experience going on. So I see that we're just out of time. So I want to thank you all so much for all your fantastic questions. I'm so sorry if we didn't quite get to all of them. And now I'm going to invite Megan to sign off. Thank you for your help.
Bye, thanks.
And we have a ton of great stuff going on over at MOS at Home. Let's see. Show you here. If you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting the Museum of Science by visiting us at engage. Or at www. Okay. I'm going to start that over. Sorry. We have, so follow us on social media or check out our website. It is www.mos.org/mos at home. And if you enjoyed this program and you'd like to consider supporting the Museum of Science, you can visit engaged.mos.org/welcome. And that support will help us provide science experiences online and help us ensure that this content can be accessed from home at no cost. So thank you again so much for joining us, and I will see you next time.